So now we're going to move to a different place in a slightly different time. We're going to leave Mesopotamia and the Levant behind and move to Egypt. You'll notice that the class is organized according to geographic regions, but it's also informally organized temporally as well. So that means I wanted to start with Mesopotamia because that is where complex civilization started in earnest and with more urbanism than it does in Egypt. So we started with Mesopotamia first, but then we continued it all the way through with 8th, 7th, 6th century BCE. Now we're going to go back in time, go to Egypt, and look at complex civilization there. I am an Egyptologist. It is my area of interest, so there's that. There's specialization. But also, when I was designing this class, Women in Power in the Ancient World, it became clear to me that ancient Egypt really has a lock on this. They're the ones that allow their women into power more often, more regularly, and thus we need to make this class more Egypt-based because that's where we see the power most often. And so now we are entering into that Egyptian world and trying to understand why and how females were able to take so much power. What makes Egypt different from other parts of the world? Having the Levant and Mesopotamia in your mind will be useful. It'll be an interesting foil for you to see how this works. Now, we're starting with a map. Always love to start with a map. And we are looking at essentially the first regional state on the planet. That means that you may have had a number of city-states along the Nile Valley and the Nile Delta, but these city-states coalesced under one king, not in an imperial fashion where you have an emperor who's letting the kings of city-states continue and he's telling them what to do with an overlay, hierarchical overlay on these city-states. No, there's now no more kings of individual places, no more individual rulers. At the most, you might have a governor of a particular province, an elite landowner, but you have a king at the center of this regional state who is ruling over everybody. And you have a shared culture within this geographic region from the Nile Valley all the way up to the Delta to the north. Similar pottery, similar religious schemes, similar language, similar ethnicity of the people, though that gets more complicated. And this is unusual. For a place to coalesce and unify into a regional state at this time period in history is strange and bizarre. We just left Mesopotamia and the Levant, and you saw the amount of conflict, the amount of violence that occurred between city-states, the amount of coalition building as a constant and recurring element of their life. Now when you look at the map of Egypt, you see a place that the Nile, one river, not two, as we saw in Mesopotamia with multiple offshoots, that one river unites, that one river connects from north to south as a giant artery digging through this land. The Nile in many ways creates a giant riverine oasis. If it weren't for the Nile, you would just have a desert expanse of the Sahara in Northeast Africa. That's all it would be. But the Nile carves through the bedrock of Northeast Africa and floods every year when there are massive rains from the south that flood up the river. And that flooding brings with it a tremendous amount of rich silt, flooding the areas on either side of the Nile and up into the delta, almost the entire delta, with this thick black earth. So when the Nile waters recede, you have completely new farmland that you really don't even have to plow much. You can just throw your seeds in there, let the animals and children run over them, and you're good to go. Egypt provides a very easy life in comparison to some of the other places that we've looked at, particularly in Mesopotamia and the Levant. Easier farming, easier unification. It's also, if you look at the map, much more protected, much more safe, just with geographic boundaries that are provided to it. So you have the Mediterranean Sea to the north, very useful boundary. It's hard to invade any place via sea. Egypt is protected by deserts on either side of its river. There's miles and miles of desert on the western side in particular as you move into the Sahara, and there are dots of oases that you can travel between in a donkey caravan. In the ancient world, they didn't have camels until somewhat late. That would have been your main means of traveling in the western desert, but it makes it very hard, again, to invade from the west. On the eastern side, your desert expanse isn't as large, but it's expansive enough, and it's very, very difficult for any sort of force to invade from the east. Complicating that even more is the Red Sea they're on the other side of the eastern desert. So how are you going to come in from Saudi Arabia across the Red Sea with all of your boats, and then you're going to walk across the eastern desert and try to invade the Nile Valley? It's a very difficult proposition to get into that Nile Valley proper, except through the Nile Valley, which means that the people in control of the Nile Valley can monitor who's coming and going, who's there, who's coming in from the deserts. They're going to be able to build watchtowers out at the fringes of Egypt and see everywhere in the land who might potentially be coming in to harm this place, while also knowing that geographically they are well suited for defense and protection. Even to the south of Egypt, they are doubly protected. It gets drier as you move to the south. The inundation doesn't flood with the rich, silty earth in the same way in the south as it does further to the north. So it's a rockier desert expanse, first of all. And then second of all, starting at Elephantine, modern-day Aswan, you have a series of Nile cataracts. A cataract, you think of that, you're like, oh, it's an eye disease or something. Cataract essentially means blockage. And a Nile cataract is a blockage of the Nile. It is boulders of stone that the Nile cannot cut through as easily as the bedrock of sandstone or limestone. It's boulders made of a granodiorite or granite that the Nile can slowly carve down, but it takes much longer to carve those harder stones. So starting at Elephantine, you're going down with your boat, you'll all of a sudden hit a giant blockade of big granite boulders in the middle of the river. If you're coming through with some sort of naval force, naval invasion, you're going to have to take your boats out of the water, have your guys carry those around this particular cataract, put them back in the water, and head further upstream. But know that starting at Aswan, at ancient Elephantine Island, that there are 6 cataracts going down the Nile into modern-day Sudan. So it is extraordinarily protected, just in terms of river travel. So if the river is the one thing that keeps the Nile connected to itself, that allows a king to move upstream in 2 weeks, downstream in a week, and really control his people in a region, it's also the very thing that keeps the invader out to Egypt's south. Because starting at Aswan, you don't have that ease of travel. You're going to have to find a way to move ships around these cataracts and blockades. So, Egypt is a special and unusual place geographically. It's super protected, it's hard to invade, which means that in this strange Egyptian place, and today even as well, you're going to have a kind of continuity, cultural continuity that you will not have arguably on any other place on the planet. I don't know of any other place on the planet that is so protected that it's kind of a weird petri dish of cultural sameness, of development without as much outside influence as other places. I am not saying that Egypt does not have outside influences. The best way to get into Egypt and the best cross-cultural connection you're going to see is from the Levant to Egypt, across the Sinai. There you're going to get all kinds of cross-cultural connections between people of the southern Levant in particular and ancient Egypt. Thus you get stories like the Exodus story, a bunch of people who call themselves Israelites who are in Egypt under the bonds of slavery, find a way to escape, move back up to their homeland in the Levant to the north. So there is cultural connection to be sure. But having said that, Egypt is more protected than any other place on earth, such that it can maintain the same language for over 3,000 years, the same religious systems for over 3,000 years, the same authoritarian form of divine kingship for over 3,000 years. That's something that Levantine or Mesopotamian peoples were very jealous of when they would look at from afar and see the ultimate authority that the Egyptian king is able to impose on his people. Just a small example of this. In Mesopotamia and the Levant, there are established legal intellectualisms. In the Bible, you've got the book of Deuteronomy and you have Leviticus, which is law after law after law, explaining how people should live, how they should work. Hammurabi of Babylon established a law code saying what should happen if you murder somebody, what should happen if a slave dies versus a free man, all of these different legal codes organizing society. The king, in this case, Hammurabi, is the one granting this legal code to his people. In Egypt, we have hardly any laws preserved. You don't see them. There's a couple of laws written down in in ancient texts, and people argue, are they real laws? Are they not? There's no legal code to speak of in ancient Egypt, probably because they didn't need one, because society was so authoritarian and so centralized, looking towards a leader, that it was up to that leader to make the law of the moment. It wasn't up to people to determine their own social rules in relation to a king. It was up to the divine king to interpret what came down from the gods and just tell people this is the way it's going to be. The lack of a law code in ancient Egypt is arguably the best example of how authoritarian this ancient state actually was. Now, so you see here the pyramids of Giza. I think it's a wonderful image to start with when you think of cultural continuity, authoritarian regimes, what Egypt is able to create. And I want to pause here and think about how these pyramids were built, probably the first one around 2600 BCE, as you see here. But the oldest pyramid goes back to around 2800 BCE. These pyramids then last as a religious symbol, as a way of burying the king, all the way up until 1800 BCE. This is a cultural element that continues for some time, that even when Nubian kings to the south are building taller, smaller pyramids for themselves in 300 CE of the Common Era, they're using pyramids as well. So this one architectural element has this extraordinarily long lifetime. And it's something that we would expect. When I'm talking about the New Kingdom and talking about kings like Amenhotep III or Ramses II, the pyramids that I'm showing you here, the Giza pyramids, are already more than a millennium old. It's hard for us to understand that kind of cultural continuity, the idea that the king will always be here, that Egypt will always last. Indeed, the pyramids are the only of the ancient wonders left on this planet. The lighthouse north of Alexandria is gone. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are gone. The pyramids, they're still there. They last, and we are able to go and visit them and stand in front of them and think about who built them. And this is something that when you're standing in front of the pyramids hits you in almost a visceral manner. I don't expect many of you watching this will have been able to have the privilege of standing in front of the Giza pyramids. When you do, if you do, and I hope it's a when, not an if, you can get right up close to them. This wouldn't have happened in the ancient world. They would have kept you farther away. You would have had a different entree into the site. Social hierarchies would have organized where you could go and where you couldn't. As a tourist, you can go right up to those pyramids. You can touch those pyramids. No, they're not covered with a smooth white limestone anymore. In the ancient world, with that smooth casing of limestone, when the sun hit them, they would have in many cases been blinding. You wouldn't have been able to see the light. The sunlight was so strong coming off of those pyramids. Think of the last time you went to the Getty Center in Brentwood on a sunny day and you're walking around amongst that white limestone and it's so bright it's bouncing off the floor and you can't even see what's around you. I worked there for some years and that's what it feels like. In one small white limestone building, imagine a giant 50-story white limestone pyramid in front of you and how blinding that can be. But let's go back to Giza. You're standing in front of it and you look up and it's just like, holy God, how could this even be possible? People start to doubt that humans built them. People start to doubt whether or not the ancient Egyptians would have been capable of such a feat. They start to think in their minds, it's impossible. There's no way that people could have created such a structure. We have a whole television show on the History Channel devoted to things like this called Ancient Aliens, which I've been asked to be on multiple times, and I've said no each and every time. But there's this notion when you look at the pyramids that this is not of this world, that this is superhuman, alien, if you like. It is beyond our knowledge. It is beyond our ability. The ancients couldn't have come up with this, much less the ancient Egyptians. How could this even be possible? When you think like that, you are falling into exactly the thinking trap that the ancient Egyptian pharaohs wanted you to fall into. You are believing them greater than you. You are looking at what they ordered built with the exploited labor that they were able to control and manipulate and thinking, these men who built this, they must be gods. How else could something like this be standing here in front of me? I cannot understand it any other way. When you see the pyramid, you understand power. I can only imagine what it would have been like capped with that white limestone with the sun shining off of it. But this helps me to get you to understand the idea of divine kingship and how Egypt's authoritarian power is different from Mesopotamia. It is different from the Levant. It is different from ancient Greece and if they had kingship, and different from Rome when they had kingship. It is a different kind of power structure that is so much more unassailable, so much less judged and picked apart. Its people were less cynical towards it. There was this understanding that the king was a god among his people. He was indeed called the perfect God, the good God, if you like. Necher Nefer in Egyptian language. He was somebody that communicated between the heavens and this earth. The pyramid makes sense, right? Especially a 50-story pyramid on the Giza Plateau. He's able to reach between the two realms, and only he is able to reach between the two realms. And only Egypt and its protected geography could have created such a divine kingship. In Mesopotamia, the Levant, or Greece, or Rome, or Persia, where geography is not boundaried, where there are many ways to invade and many ways to take out somebody in power, your kingship to its people will seem immediately more vulnerable, more assailable, more tendentious. It's something that you cannot guarantee. Father will not necessarily produce son who will produce grandson that will keep kingship going forever. In the Egyptian mindset, on the other hand, with its protection, its ideas of cultural continuity, its conservatism at all costs, same language, same religion, same system of government, this kingship is meant to be perfected and going on forever. That's its most ideal and perfected understanding. Son following the Father forever through time. This is, and bear with me, it's going to seem a little strange, this is the very foundation of female power in ancient Egypt. In the most authoritarian of regimes, in the most unequal of societies, is where a woman is going to find an entree to power more often than not, more often than any other place on the planet. It's in this most unequal of systems that only she will be trusted to act on behalf of her God King. Maybe that God King is her father, maybe it's her husband, maybe it's her brother, maybe it's her son. But if you need your divine kingship to follow this direct linear succession from father to son to grandson, and there's a snag, there's some kind of a problem. Maybe the boy is too young, he's only an 8-year-old. Or maybe the guy that's chosen is a little bit cracked in the head and not quite right. Or there's some other issue. Would you want the uncle of that boy coming in to rule on his behalf? No. Would you want some other male advisor to come in and rule on behalf of the king who's maybe a little touched in the head? No. Those are threatening things. Having masculine potential aggression coming in to the throne room, to the kingship itself, is problematic. The ancient Egyptian king needed to surround himself with female assets. Those assets could be mother, sister, wife, or daughter, but those were the things that would keep him safe. Those were the things that were extensions of his power. And if he couldn't rule for whatever reason, it was the female who was going to step into the breach, keep the dynastic line going, keep all of this perfected and secure. So Egypt's map, in a way, tells us that they have protection, that they have continuity, that they're going to have conservatism. And that map then, by extension, tells us that the female is the one who's going to come in as a broker of power in her own right. It will be in ancient Egypt's best interest to educate their elite females, to make sure that they're up to the task of rulership, to make sure that culturally there's no pushback against a female who's able to read and write and order people around. This is something that they're going to need to protect this most unequal of authoritarian regimes. It's interesting, if you're working on podcasts or final papers, you might think, well, is it always this way in authoritarian regimes? You could do a compare and contrast and look at modern authoritarian regimes around the globe and see where the female is invited into power, where the similarities and differences lie. Because many authoritarian regimes do not allow a female into power and instead rely on a more militarized structure to their authoritarian regime. It's a very interesting question. It's something that I would encourage all of you to think about. Do more cross-cultural research in your mind and look at the authoritarian regimes that exist today and if they use female power in the same way. Indeed, I think female power is used so often to prop up an authoritarian regime that it could be one of the reasons that we're often hostile to it, that we often distrust it. We might think that Hillary Clinton coming in is only to rule on behalf of a shadow Bill Clinton presidency, that there's something disingenuous happening there, that she's the representative of something that is more familial, that is more nepotistic than we would like. And so there might be pushback without her even being able to talk about it or verbalize it against the female in power, because in complex human history, the female is so often aligned with the authoritarian regime. Okay, so back to Egypt and this idea of the geography creating the stability, creating the divine kingship, a divine kingship par excellence, unlike anywhere else in the world. These systems, these human systems that ancient Egypt created, invade and percolate into every other aspect of the universe, of the religion, of their culture. Now, the image that I'm showing you here is a shocking one, very sexual, very off-putting for some of us who don't think of the creation of the world in such a sexual way, or who aren't used to thinking of gods and goddesses as sexual beings. So the image is of the god Atum. And the god Atum has an erect penis, and he is producing his future self, which is pretty extraordinary. The ancient Egyptians believed that the beginning of the universe happened in a kind of Big Bang of orgasm, if you like, of masculine orgasm. The female is not anywhere associated with the creation of the Egyptian world. The Egyptian world is a masculine endeavor. And if you like, you can compare that to a European old world conception of creation, where you have Mother Earth and Father Heaven, and it's the female that is the one that is responsible for creation, new life. In Egypt, they turn that on its head. The sky is a sky goddess, and the earth is an earth god. And the creation of the universe does not happen through female pregnancy. It happens through masculine sexuality. And to get even more specific and maybe more uncomfortable for you guys as you're watching this in the comfort of your own homes, through masculine masturbation. The male is said very specifically in all kinds of texts that the ancient Egyptians carefully inscribed in pyramids, on coffins, in all kinds of places where rebirth needed to happen after death. They talk about the male god sexually recreating himself through sex with himself. They talk about the hand of the god that is creating this masturbatory act as a feminine element of the male god. There's actually a female priestess title that we'll talk about in a bit that's called the hand of the god. You can imagine what those rituals in the temples would have actually been like, because she's called the hand of the god. Essentially, she's the female sexual exciter of the god in this masturbatory moment. So looking at this image and seeing it looks spectral and cosmic and strange, the Egyptians thought of it this way as well. And the way that they understood the beginnings of the universe was not as one static moment where God's thinking to himself, I will separate the water from, or the earth and the heavens, and I will separate the water from the land and go through a process like that. Or where God goes through a creation of 6 days and then rests on the seventh and it's done, right? In ancient Egypt, creation is constant and ongoing, and it never stops. Every time somebody dies and is mummified to be reborn, creation is happening again in the Egyptian mindset. Every time the sun sets and rises in the eastern horizon, creation has happened again. Every time the Nile floods its banks and recedes with all of that life-giving silt, rebirth and creation has happened again. The Egyptians built temples to their gods to maintain this ongoing creation. This wasn't a one-time act, fait accompli, world is done, and now I live in it. It was their understanding that if they didn't keep the gods and goddesses, particularly the gods of creation in this case though, happy, if they didn't give them the right exchange, set up the right temples, create the right circumstances for the sun god to rise and set every day, that creation could abandon them. They could be left to chaos. Their understanding of creation is of, and they tell us this very specifically in stories, is of the god Atum floating in chaos, pre-creation if you like, floating in infinite blackness, primeval matter, infinite time. And he has a conception of himself within this black, infinite, timeless space. And he realizes that he can create his own body, his own self. And he sexually creates himself through that body. It may seem like a paradox, but religious things always are. They're always meant to be mysterious, and for a reason we are not meant to understand them. But the god Atum creates his own self through a sexual act with himself. I mean, it makes sense, right? How do you create new life in this world but through sex? Anybody who lived in ancient Egypt would have known this. They see the farm animals all around them. They see the humans all around them. There's less privacy in the ancient world than there is today. So sexuality is happening all around them. If you have one being at the beginning of time and space and matter, then that one being has sex with himself. And the ancient Egyptian texts are very clear. The god reached out his hand so that he might make orgasm with his hand, is the way we translate these things very intellectually and coldly in our Egyptian translations. These are very fun graduate classes you can imagine, right? And then this god sneezes out light and space. And that light and space is the god Shu. And then he spits out moisture, Tefnut, who's the female moisture of the earth. So we have dry, light-filled air and deep, dark moisture. So there's a male-female pair. They then do the normal sexual business with the male and a female. You don't have to have the hand and the god anymore. And they then produce the earth, a male god, and the sky, a female goddess. And then those two have sex and produce 4 more divinities. And those divinities are Osiris, Seth, his brother, Isis, and Nephthys, all brother-sister pair. Isis and Horus pair up, and Nephthys and Seth pair up. And there's a whole host of mythological stories that come thereafter. But my point for you, for this class, for women in power in the ancient world and how it works in Egypt, is how strange and wonderful that this translates into power ideologically for the woman in Egypt. And you might be thinking, that's very strange, Professor Cooney. How could this even happen? You're taking all of the agency away from the female entity and giving it to the masculine entity for the very creation of the universe. And I would say, indeed, this is true. But think about how much in human history women have been blamed for giving birth to a girl instead of a boy. And her body produced that. Think of how many times in human history a woman has been blamed or even put to death or divorced or discarded because she couldn't get pregnant. When you put the onus of fertility on the female, in a way, it gives society even more opportunity to control her womb, to blame her, to exile her if she's not producing progeny as you think she should. In the Egyptian mindset, it puts all of the weight and responsibility on the male in society, which is very interesting and translates into real world issues in a very interesting way. For example, there are texts of divorce that talk about a woman divorcing her husband, and they say that they can't get pregnant, they can't have children, and she says that she is dry. And everyone, that's the text. It's not she is sterile. It means that he is sterile. He's not able to impregnate her and put any seed in her. And so the blame and the onus is put on the man in ancient Egypt in every domestic relationship where you couldn't have children. That's an extraordinary twist of the mind, to have a father earth instead of a mother earth, right? So it changes all kinds of ideas of power in society in ways that I think are unexpected, and you wouldn't actually think of that. So when you think of creation of the universe as being a masculine endeavor, that also translates into what you need to create the circumstances of that rebirth. So if this creation is something that's never ending, that has to constantly be ongoing, and you're creating temples for it and creating the circumstances, the ideal circumstances to make sure that happens, you need to give that God of creation proper protection. You need to give his creation a proper protected space, a womb-like space, if you will, to grow and be nurtured in safety. You need to make sure that you're creating fiercely protective goddesses that surround this male divinity of epic creation to make sure that all of this is safe and protected. And so you will have the notion of the male deity of creation giving birth to himself, but giving birth to himself by means of and with help of the female in a way that empowers the divine element. So let's just think of the sun god, for example. The sun god, when he sets in the west, according to the ancient Egyptians, is dying. He's dying in the manner of Osiris. He's reaching the end of his years. When he dies, however, he impregnates his own mother, the sky goddess, with his own future self by entering into her mouth and, in a sense, impregnating her that way with his own semen, with his own future self. He then moves through the 12 hours of night within the sky, within her body, until he is born from her in the morning the next day in the east. And there you see that it's only the sun god that has the spark of creation. But if he didn't have Nut, the sky goddess, to impregnate, to enter into, to have a safe womb-like protected space for his gestation, he could never be reborn. So the female is an essential element to this entire cosmic creation. She needs to be fiercely protected. She needs to be mother-like. She needs to be lover-like. She needs to be daughter-like. She needs to be all three generations to the God of Creator at the same time. We'll see this translate in real-world terms to the royal women, who are either king's mother, king's sister, king's wife, or king's daughter. They all surround him. He's at the center of the wheel of power, and then these women are the satellites around it. They are the king's best assets.